So I think we determined that I would just introduce myself because we don't know if there's someone meant to do that. So I know most of you, I think. I'm Leila Harris. I'm here in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, and also in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. So undoubtedly, you see facts and figures all the time, and you've heard, I'm sure, many times, the sort of dire state of the provision of water services and sanitation services around the world. This is something that Unilever produces in terms of a graphic, but we see a number of things like this that circulate that suggest, for instance, that close to 1 million people don't have access to safe and affordable water on a regular basis. And when you look at sanitation, that number might be closer to 2.4 billion. And this is despite progress made with the Millennium Development Goals, and in fact, the declaration of achievement of these targets in sites, including South Africa and Ghana, that I'll be speaking to today. So you've undoubtedly also familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. And here the idea by 2030 we would have safe water and sanitation for all by 2030. In 2010, the UN General Assembly also approved the idea of the human right to water and sanitation in the General Assembly. So part of what I'll be speaking to today is in this broad context about what does this mean to work on and ensure safe water and sanitation for all. And what are the key debates around implementation, and especially uneven implementation of access to these basic services? I'll also be linking this idea of differential service provision to ideas of citizenship and state, which is the core focus of the talk today. So just to give you a sense of the project that I'm speaking to, a lot of you I'm sure have heard about this project in different ways because several of you in the room are working on it in different ways. But this is an ongoing, multi-sited, multi-year project looking at the situation in Accra, Ghana, and Cape Town, South Africa, focused particularly on sites that would be considered underserved or relatively impoverished. And what we're doing across these sites is we're looking at policies as they're playing out with respect to access to water and sanitation, but also governance, particularly participatory governance. We're really interested in the lived experiences and negotiations of the conditions of uneven service delivery and use, so differentiated water use and access. The narrative and representational politics around these issues, so how people attribute meaning to this. So in brief, of course, we know that human right to water and sanitation is important for public health, it's important for economy, but here we're interested primarily in the meanings that people attach to this, and particularly in terms of politics and ideas around belonging or inclusion or difference, and how that gets read through uneven access to services. And again, that's the core of what I'll be speaking to today. And we're interested in this broader appreciation that comes out of a comparative study like this and how it might allow us to do the work of implementing human right to water access or participatory governance in ways that understand and take seriously those lived experiential dimensions of water and access. So this has had contributions from a number of team members, all of whom are listed here. And of course, there's also been several IRES theses by some of those contributors that are available. So when I say how do people attribute meanings to this, and how does this graft onto broader ideas around social and political dimensions of life and experience, I'll just give you one or two quick examples. In a basic sense, it could be how someone narrates and understands their lack of consistent or safe access to water or sanitation in terms of ideas of inclusion and belonging in broader politics and communities. So senses of enfranchisement or disenfranchisement or belonging might be key to that, or how inequalities are read through those experiences. Another example is here. This is from 2011 when the Ghanaian government decided not to renew the contract of Avril, which was a private consortium that had operated in the capital city of Accra for the 5 prior years. And if you read the documentation about this, it's filled with ideas around citizenship and belonging precisely. So quotes such as the ones that appear in this news article from 2011 that say Accra's water should be managed by Ghanaians for Ghanaians. So refusing the idea of transnational involvement and the privatization of the capital city's water. So the way that I'll proceed for today's talk is I'm going to give you a little bit on context. I'm going to lay out a little bit of the core concepts and key questions that I'm interested in around the state-society nexus, recognizing that that might not be familiar to some of you. I'm going to then work through analysis of some of our data from a 2012 survey we conducted across 4 sites 2 in Accra and 2 in Cape Town. I'll be linking conditions of water access to ideas of trust in government and the state, to participatory politics and possibilities, and then a little bit of data, less so relative to the other 2 categories, but a little bit on payment for services and how different policies might receive different reception across sites such as these. And I'll also sum up and give you some key points related to the variegated histories and politics and how we can make some sense of some of the puzzles that come out of the data that I'll characterize for you. So just a map of where I'm talking about when I speak to these sites. There are, in fact, 2 more sites where qualitative work has been done around Accra. Elizabeth Dapa also did work in Medina and Gamashi. These are all sites that would be considered relatively impoverished or underserved. I can talk more about terminology if you're interested. And the specific survey data I'll be speaking to comes from the sites of Ashaiman, which is a peri-urban area that you see there northeast of the core city, and Teshi, which is a coastal community. Around the sites of Cape Town, I'll be speaking to the survey data that came from Felipe in Kailicha, and Lucy Rodina has also done qualitative work in Kailicha specifically, as has Crystal Tremblay and myself. So basically, these would both be considered former townships, predominantly black communities, and again, relatively underserved and impoverished around the site of Cape Town. So as I said, most of what I'll be speaking to comes from this 478 household surveys conducted in 2012. And all of these sites would be considered relatively underserved. So in fact, among the worst that you could expect to find across these sites. It's not meant to represent Cape Town writ large or Accra writ large, but trying to understand the sites where these issues are going to be most pronounced or severe. So the sites were all selected with that in mind purposely. With respect to state politics, it's also interesting, I argue, because you're looking at those marginal sites where state reach might be most contested. And I think that will become clearer as I work through the talk. So some of the key questions I'm interested in speaking to today are the following. How are invocations of the state and government, especially through trust in this data, linked with water services, access, and perceived quality? How is participatory governance potentially linked to material conditions of water access or services, especially quality as well? And what might this tell us for the question of evolving state-society relations and dynamics? And especially, can we learn something by looking at these 2 quite distinct sites of Accra and Cape Town? And I'm happy to return to that in the Q&A if you're interested in talking more about the rationale for the comparative design. But again, I hope some of it will be more apparent as I work through the data. So part of the reason these questions are interesting to me is that state-society dynamic is precisely what's often targeted through what we might refer to as neoliberalization agendas. So shifting ideas around the state, its appropriate role, citizen subjects, and what their appropriate role might be. So for instance, maybe working more towards individuated senses of responsibility, or rollback of particular state services that might be linked to privatization and commodification of something like water. So again, several data points will speak more specifically to that neoliberalization question and agenda. So some of the key theoretical debates, and you'll notice there are many, but these are things just to give you a little bit more background. I'm interested in debates around everyday states and stateness. So this basically refers to the everyday encounters of people with state practices or outcomes, less so in the sort of formal institutions or spheres of power, but more everyday interactions and how the state is manifest through something like as simple and mundane as service delivery. Related to that, there's been work increasingly on political ecologies of the state, a new special issue coming out in political geography that I helped co-edit, and then also recent things on this at the recent AAGs that I also participated in. And so here questions are around how does the state invoke or enroll different resources? How do debates around environment become core to contestations around state or state power or particular institutional functions? And I put a note so I wouldn't forget around Naomi Oreskes here. How many of you went to her talk the other night? Do you remember the argument that's core to what she's talking about in terms of how the state is central to why there's climate denialism? Or if you've read the book, you can also tell me. Right, so the whole argument in the book that they wrote is basically, why do we have climate denialism in terms of climate change? It's not because of the science, it's not because of disputes, it's about governance and the appropriate role of the state. So she links the role of these specific physicists who had worked on the Cold War and how they became central to climate denialism post-Cold War, in part because they were fearful that climate change recognition meant state intervention, meant the fear of communism and having too large of a state. So that whole neoliberal agenda was in fact part and central to what she and her co-author attribute as at the core of climate denialism. So in essence, she doesn't call herself a political ecologist of the state, but that's a core similar question in terms of how environmental issues get wrapped up with debates around appropriate state policy or interventions. So as well, Hannah Whitman in our own department has focused a lot on environmental citizenship, but this is how people understand themselves in relation to environmental questions, or again, what is the appropriate role in activism or citizenship around these environmental issues. And a subset of some of these has focused a little bit more centrally on infrastructures and how infrastructures become important either to how people understand themselves or, again, the refashioning of state institutions or politics. So Nikhil Anand's work in the context of Mumbai has looked at water infrastructures and how people necessarily activate and respond to the state in and through these infrastructures. So he talks about it in terms of infrapolitics or pressure and how citizens come to put pressure on engineers and state agents to receive basic services such as water. So in terms of, again, what this looks like or how these questions come together, this is some earlier work that I did in Turkey. Just to give you a brief example, part of this work looked at the transformation of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and also irrigation access through those transformations. And some of my arguments in this piece and one other speak to the way that citizens narrate the state differently, in part as a result of these services through irrigation. Legitimacy of the state is refashioned in terms of the service delivery. There is consolidation of certain institutions, so state hydraulic works and others become more powerful in different ways. And also people narrate a different sense of belonging to the state. So these are the ways that this state-society dynamics are potentially refashioned in and through infrastructural politics or practices. So I added this slide in part because I know it's something that some people don't want to hear about, and I've been told some people are allergic to the term in IRES. So I thought it would just be useful to say what I mean when I say neoliberalization and neoliberal water governance. Again, this could be many hours of discussion, but just to give a quick flash. So neoliberalization refers to, particularly in the past several decades, the politically guided intensification of commodification or market rule. And we talk about this in the realm of water governance by referring to a suite of practices, some of which you can see kind of are in tension with each other or maybe at cross purposes. But this has involved, for instance, privatization, commodification of water, full cost recovery, focus on efficiency, but also democratization and participatory governance would all be linked processes that some people sum up in terms of neoliberalization processes and agendas. This will become important as I go to the conclusion, but Brenner, Peck, and Theodore have argued that we really need to understand neoliberalization only in and through specific articulations. So in context, how these practices and policies mesh with specific institutional forms, histories, and politics in each site. And this becomes core to how I read some of the data from Cape Town and Accra. So what is the context of water access and governance in these two cities that I'm speaking to? Just to highlight a couple of things. One that I've already mentioned is the private sector participation in Accra that was required as part of loan conditionalities of the World Bank. So that operated for 5 years. You have a huge deficit in the urban system of Accra, and this is changing very recently with the coming online last year of a saltwater desalination plant to serve some of the most underserved sites, including Teshi. But previously what has been the mode is that they basically have a rationing schedule that goes through the network. So about half of the city would have access to a pipe network in terms of the overall number of people in Accra, but you might only receive water, let's say, 1 day a week because of the rationing schedule. So the basic city moves water through the pipes on different schedules. Some better served areas might have every day. But just having access to the pipe doesn't necessarily mean you have regular water access. In Cape Town, it's a quite different context. You have nearly universal access to water, including in line with the Joint Monitoring Program definitions of within 200 meters of the home. In fact, Cape Town is going much more aggressively for the 50-meter mark within the home, close to 50 meters. You have specific policies that have been rolled out over the past several decades, including the Free Basic Water Policy. There's been legal contestation that has led to those particular policies, and I'll speak to this as well, but you've also have a really intensifying active protests around the country around precisely water and sanitation services and delivery. So let's just go to the survey, and I'll give you a sense of some of what came out of the survey. This just shows you among our respondents what were the modes of primary access to water. And just a couple of things you'll note. In South Africa, there's much higher numbers of in-home connection. But while in South Africa, the number on the whole for within 200 meters of the home would be about 97%, so fairly close to universal access. Here you'd have about 60% in Khayelitsha and Philippi who are reporting in-home or in-house access. Another key difference you'll note is that nearly half of the respondents in Accra depend on vendors for regular access to water. So how it would work in relation to what I said previously is only half of the city has actual access to a pipe, but then often it's sold through sachet and buckets to serve other people who don't have the regular piped access. So it would still be through the network, but indirectly through the vending system. So overall, what do we see when we look at questions of access to water, quality, and also satisfaction? A couple of notable things. In each of these graphs, you'll see Ghana on the top, South Africa on the bottom. So you'll see fairly high rates of people in South Africa reporting relative ease of access. So 83% agree or strongly disagree. 92% say it's of good quality, the water that they're getting. But much lower numbers of people in South Africa say they're satisfied with the services, so 64%. So that speaks directly to the idea that there's something else besides access and quality that's going into their satisfaction. So again, table that. In Ghana, you'll see the numbers are much lower, consistent with what we know from the formal statistics as well. So nonetheless, nearly 60% say their water is of good quality. Closer to 27, 28% say that it's easy to access, or that they're satisfied with water services. Affordability is also a big challenge. So nearly 70% in Ghana do not agree that their water is affordable among our survey respondents. And if you're attentive, you might notice a really high number of the South African respondents decided not to answer that question. And again, table that, and we'll get back to that when I get more to the politics of some of these issues in a moment. So in terms of this questions around state and how that links to differential water access and services, basically we looked at the relationship between trust in the government as responded on our survey and some of the other dimensions of water material conditions. So we can report a couple of things in terms of what can we say about how people think of the state in and through water access and services. So you'll see in general the South African respondents trust the government quite a bit more than in Ghana. So this is the do not trust figure. So 55% of the Ghanaian respondents said they do not trust the government, and it's a third in South Africa. In general, in South Africa, people reported higher levels of trust in the community and in NGOs. And if you looked at the different demographic groups, women in South Africa had the highest rates of trust overall. So we decided to look at the relationship between trust and how people answered questions around ease of access, quality of water, and satisfaction of services. So testing that statistically, we find in Ghana there's no relationship between these conditions of water and trust in government. But in South Africa, there's a statistically significant relationship in terms of the people who responded that their water is of good quality and they're satisfied with water services and trust in government. And it's in the expected relationship where better trust, a better quality water or better satisfaction is linked statistically with higher trust in terms of the data. So in that way, it's sort of interesting. We can see there's not a relationship in Ghana, but there is in South Africa. As well, in South Africa, access to water is not significant, but quality and satisfaction is. Just to step back for a second, and here this will be a theme that's repeated, this makes a lot of sense when we think about the context of South Africa, where there's fairly universal access in a basic needs sense. People can go and get water for free, largely, in the sites where we're studying, for what they need to drink or what they need to wash their clothes. But is the water of sufficient quality? How does it relate to ideas of equity? And you might know in the Constitution of South Africa, there's a guarantee for the free access to water and sanitation. When the ANC came to power, there was strong discourse and focus on equitable rights to basic services, water, sanitation, and housing for all South Africans. So redress of apartheid policies that had led to this severely differentiated landscape of service quality. So it makes a lot of sense when you back up intuitively that access is not the key consideration for South African respondents, but if they're satisfied or if they consider the water to be of good quality, that would map much more directly onto these discourses of equity and redress that are so strong in the South African context. Again, I'll speak a little bit more to that in just a moment. So we also ask people directly, when you get good access to water, does this change your understanding of the government or the local government? And you'll see that we had higher numbers of people saying yes in South Africa, though my collaborator changed the wording of the question without talking to me first. So you'll see that she said, I'm proud because I get access to water. But nonetheless, it somehow verifies the statistical test when you see that the direct answer was, again, stronger in South Africa. So again, why is it that we see this relationship in South Africa but not in Ghana? And I'm going to argue it's precisely because of these geo-institutional histories, the specific discourses and narratives that circulate in South Africa, where basic services are directly tied to government legitimacy and responsibility on a daily basis, and with every election. It was core to the rise of the ANC in terms of the new democratic South Africa post-1994. So these specific discursive links is what you're seeing showing up here, where government responsibility and also legitimacy is directly tied to whether or not one is getting suitable access to basic services. So again, you also have the specific policies, such as free basic water and human right to water, that were in essence seen filter all the way down to the everyday senses. So people appreciate and understand, and in some ways are asserting their right to water. And you see that, I think, come up in other ways in terms of the qualitative analysis that Lucy and others have done as well. So I hope it's a little bit clear, but this promise of equitable services is tied directly to these ideas of redress and moving away from the considerable differences that communities felt along racial and impoverishment lines in South Africa. So again, as I mentioned, I think this helps us make a little bit of sense why access might not be paramount, but quality and satisfaction are more directly tied to ideas of equity. So just to make a couple more points on the state before I move to a couple of things around citizenship. Here, the point being that in both country contexts, in Ghana and South Africa, people made a strong response saying that it's the government responsibility or the government should be doing more around water services in these sites. There were, just in terms of triangulation, other ways in which I think we can see a glimpse of some of these relationships and how they're characterized. We asked a series of questions that included, we feel that no one cares about us. And if you see in South Africa, 60% of the respondents agreed with that statement, and lower numbers among the populations in Ghana. So again, we tried to look at some of the relationships between community participation and material conditions of water as well. And what we found in those analyses is that trust, as you might expect, is highly correlated with community participation. Because there's fairly low levels of direct water governance participation, we used a broader notion of community participation. So if they answered one to several questions related to engagement in the community, they were considered as being participating. And so that's part of what we use to track these questions. And interesting, this bottom point, that a strong number of participants in both sites said they wish they could participate more in community governance. So it speaks to broadly to questions of marginality, perhaps. So, and that's just visually represented here. So I don't want to go a long way into this, in part because I want to sum up and hear from you, but I will give you a quick glimpse of this. And it's complicated and nuanced enough, and it's still something that's hard to get fully all of the details around. But again, in terms of how we're looking at the relationship between participation and material conditions of water access, I'll just give you a couple quick points, hoping it's enough that we can talk about it. So you could imagine, if you're asking the question, how does one's access or services potentially relate to participation or willingness to participate, and we looked at both, you could imagine it going in different directions. You could imagine on the upper left part of the graph here that someone who does not have good access to services would participate a lot, in part, as Anand argues with infrapolitics, to demand and work towards improved conditions. The correlate of that might be that as conditions improve, you might see people on this apathetic side. So if your conditions of water are good, this is not something that one has to engage with or work on the community for. That's something that might characterize Vancouverites. And the other axis, you could see that maybe people who are participating a lot feel enfranchised, generally have a more positive sense about their water conditions, and that these reinforce each other. Or because they're working in the community, the outcome might be improved water conditions due to their engagement. Perhaps as well, people who have not good conditions of water are also not participating, and so generally are disenfranchised or marginal to these broader political questions and the outcomes. So understanding that this could go in lots of different directions, and in fact you can see in the literatures data that suggests these different directions, usually one. So hierarchy of needs thesis you might be familiar with, and other ideas that graft onto this in particular ways. Anand, the infrapolitics kind of fits in the necessity dimension, where people by virtue of necessity are necessarily protesting and engaging with government officials around their water conditions. So again, we did some tests to look at this, and interestingly, the results suggest that material water conditions are predictive, and they're significant, of community engagement and also willingness or interest in participating. However, access and quality work in opposite directions. And I'll show you a couple other nuances, again, with respect to gender, the country, and age. For all models, participation and willingness to participate, as I said, trust was a significant predictor. But just to show you, again, very briefly, because I feel like we could get caught in this for a long time, this is access. So we see here that overall it was significant and a predictor of participation, but in the negative sense. So we'll go back to the hypotheses in a second, but here as access improved, participation diminished, again, significantly. But if you look at, as we disaggregated the data by country, so that's in the overall data set, both countries. As we disaggregate, you can see that in fact, this is more the case in Ghana than it is for South Africa. In South Africa, it's not significant statistically. And really, you might be struck by the flat line for women, especially in Ghana. So women are not sensitive to access, and it's men, basically men in Ghana, who are driving this overall significant trend in the data set. And it's the mirror opposite for quality in a way that I think is really interesting, but I'm still trying to think through the implications of. Again, you'll see the fairly flat line for men in Ghana, and this is driven by particularly women in South Africa. So it's only significant when you disaggregate in South Africa, not for Ghana, and it's predominantly the women who are driving this trend that shows up in the overall data set. So again, I don't want to belabor this too much, and I'm still trying to think of how this relates to these potential hypotheses, but in some ways you can see that it is the Ghanaian men and questions of access largely that follow that line, and then the other line, enfranchisement marginalization, which relates to quality in South Africa. Go back to the earlier stuff that I showed you on trust in the government and quality. Again, access was not the predominant characteristic in South Africa. It was quality, which in my mind makes some sense because it relates more to equitable access and the conditions of that access, not basic access, just to survive, but what are the actual characteristics and conditions of that access. So I'm happy to talk with you more about this, but if you ask me questions on this, I'm going to be sending you the full paper for responses. Okay, so where are we? And here, just to sort of speak back to some of the things that I've I've mentioned, and to try and disentangle this a little more. For South Africa, we see that quality is important for trust in government. Quality and trust are important for participation, but access is not. And that on this quality dimension in particular, it's women who are most sensitive. In Ghana, we see that trust is not linked to conditions or access of water, but access is a key variable driving participation in the negative sense. So the better conditions, the least likely people are to participate. I was overly ambitious, as many of us are, when I wrote my abstract. So on this broad question of citizenship, I had intended to share with you some of the work that Dr. Crystal Tremblay has done as a postdoc with us. And I'll just mention it because it is really interested in similar questions around state society, communication channels, and how to involve citizens more fully in water governance. But I don't have time to show you the videos or some of this work. But basically what Crystal did with her colleague Ilya Erb is they did a series of workshops in these same sites in Kailicha and Teshi. They trained people with video technology. Those participants then went out and interviewed people and then constructed their own videos on water and sanitation in their community. So those videos are available at crystaltremblay.com or on the Water Governance website. So here, just to mention it because it's very interesting, it's actually led to some interesting outcomes in both of these sites. And I think it's an important way to think about how to improve communication between these communities and different levels of government. This is a picture from the Cape Town work, but in the Teshi case, it was actually local government officials who were the participants in the workshop and who learned the video technology and who went and interviewed people in their own community. So we saw really interesting outcomes in terms of those local government officials saying that they had a better appreciation just through the process of what was happening in the community. So I'm going to move to sum up, but I'll just give you a couple more interesting points from the data from 2012 that I think actually, again, poses some interesting puzzles for us when we're thinking about these sites. So we asked, should water be free for everyone? So in this first graph, you see the outcomes from the Ghana data, and you see that most people strongly disagree or disagree, so the lion's share. This is really interesting in a site where we know that half the population in Accra is living on less than $2 a day, most likely the people we interviewed because of the sites where we did the interviews, and that 70% of the interviews also said water was unaffordable. So interesting that they still don't think water should be free. Compare that to South Africa. 90% said that water should be free for everyone. Again, just looking at the two sites, so the top one is a representation of the same question I just showed you, and the bottom is everyone should pay for the water that they use. And again, you see here a lot of agreement in Ghana that people should pay for the water they use, and a lot of disagreement in South Africa. So again, I think there's some interesting puzzles here that allow us to think through the politics of these negotiations, whether it's around neoliberal water governance or state-society relationships, and where we might have different forms of contestation or perhaps in the Ghana case, receptivity to particular policies such as full cost recovery and other policies that might be rolled out. So just to sort of move away and sum up, I think there's some interesting puzzles here that become more apparent precisely because we're looking across these quite distinct sites in terms of water access conditions, but also the politics and histories. We have this sort of interesting puzzle where the access is pretty good, especially in these underserved areas, nearly universal, certainly meets all the Joint Monitoring Program requirements, but there's a lot of contestation and concern around the quality of water. And as I've hinted, I think that here basically because of the ideas around redress, the constitutional right to water, until water provision and sanitation is seen as equitable and on par what residents in the local white suburbs enjoy, there's going to be contestation and disquiet. So there was also a fair number of indicators of disenfranchisement that I would read through the South Africa data, the 60% who said that no one cares, and the rising protests that I'll mention again in just a moment, but it's a clear indicator of political discontent and disenfranchisement in these communities. So going back to the question of human right to water, These sorts of data points allow us to think through that human right to water is not just around giving access for someone to live to the next day. It's for our bodies to function, in a minimalist sense in terms of do we have access to safe water that meets certain microbial or chemical parameters. But it's fundamentally linked to notions of equity, social political difference, and histories of contestation around those issues. And as I've tried to speak to, I think it's also linked in clear ways to ideas around states and society and what are the appropriate and relative roles that different entities might take. In South Africa, we see this strong sense that water should be free, the ideas around non-payment, which I think are really playing out in key ways politically and contemporarily in South Africa. In Ghana, we saw more of a stress on access. And again, this makes sense in a context where among our survey respondents, about a quarter had access to water in a regular through the pipe. And in the city on the whole, this is a big issue. Even with the clear affordability challenges, we see how the histories and practices, for instance, the traditions around bending, probably show up in terms of the ideas of appropriateness of payment for water in a way that shows clear distinction from the South African respondents around how appropriate a policy such as water payment might be. So I think it's interesting when you think about going back to variegated neoliberalisms, these policies are not the same everywhere. Just because we have impoverished population, we're not going to have the same effects, but there might be particular contestation or even receptivity in terms of how these articulate with local histories and contexts. So going specifically to the everyday encounters with the state, I've spoken to the ideas that quality and satisfaction are linked to ideas of trust in the government, specifically in South Africa. And I think, again, as I've mentioned, these are strongly discursively linked and also in policy senses as well because of the human right to water that is legislated and in the Constitution. So there's both policy discourses but everyday discourses that reinforce this connection between state legitimacy, trust, and water provision. Access is not as important in South Africa, in part because of the ideas around equity, as I've mentioned. And in terms of citizenship, we see again that trust is something that conditions in important ways, both participation and willingness to participate from our data set. There's these interesting tensions around how access and quality work in opposite directions, and you can just see the sub-demographics in terms of how this might play out very differently, making it pretty much impossible to make sum-up statements about these relationships, but nonetheless, they might be important in terms of conditioning participation in key ways. And I've spoken very briefly to the need for better communication, and things like the participatory video project that Crystal has done is being one small vehicle that can help us get there. I will end with just a couple notes about the protests that I've mentioned several times. So since 2009 across South Africa, but also in the Western Cape, there's been this big uptick of these service delivery protests. This is one from the news from 2014. Sanitation has a big emphasis of these protests, as has water. In this particular case, residents were burning portable toilets on the argument that it was inappropriate for the government to be giving contracts to private entities who would make profit off of their situation and not the situation of not having permanent solution to their sanitation crisis in these communities. This is a big phenomenon politically in South Africa, and other people, colleagues at the University of Western Cape, are researching it more specifically, but it's just a rapid rise, including in these sites in Philippe and Kailija in particular, over the past several years. So I will end there, and thank you very much. I hope you have some questions for me. Liz. It was about 50% used for vendors. Is that what you mean? Right, so the way that I make sense of that is people have long relied on vendors, and they see it as very appropriate that that person should be able to have a livelihood for the service that they're providing. So it's a question of how much should one have to pay, but they see it as very reasonable that they should pay something, and it's their neighbor who's earning their living off of vending the water. So it's mainly the point to say, it's not that there's resistance to the idea of non-payment. They would probably be very happy to get a free water provided the way that the South African government has been doing in these communities. But that said, it's just more a general cultural acceptance, and it's part of their daily life that they pay for water. So it's a question of what would be affordable. And other data has suggested that people in Accra pay a quarter of their income on water, which is much higher than the 5% WHO and others recommend as being the ceiling for basic services. So it's clear that affordability is a huge challenge, and even having to pay 10 cents, which would be what some people might be paying, can be a considerable sum. Okay. Oh, that's right. Is there another student who'd like to ask a question? Hopefully I've said something a little provocative to make you want to ask a question. No? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so right. So the trust was just a question where it was a Likert scale, and so we grouped together if they answered agree or strongly agree that they trust. Yeah, would you say that you trust government? I'll have to look at the exact wording. And then we asked for local and national, and the numbers were pretty much the same, even though that's actually, like, there's a lot of nuances and wrinkles, and that's one of the ones that can and should matter, and it's actually